had girls get offended, like if someone like is sharing and then another girl is like, oh well, you know, like I think that you can do this to like help the situation. The original goal would be like, but I already tried that, or like I already thought about that, or I don't want to do that.
Sure.
Like very defensive.
Sure. Yeah. When you guys are in that situation, either as a member of the small group that's kind of facing one of these challenges, or leading a discussion that's facing one of those challenges, how does it feel? What runs through your mind?
Sometimes you feel frustration.
Frustration.
Yeah. Like your intentions are good, right? And you want to kind of see the right direction, but yet you also want to talk.
Yeah.
And then, but yet you kind of want to get back to how you kind of want to do it, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And maybe your own plan of how you are leading someone who is kind of not what you want.
So is there that like kind of like internal trying to figure it out, like, okay, how much am I supposed to like let this one go versus like bring it back to sure.
I think going off of that also I like discernment, right? So it's like, how can I tell the truth about something, like say in a loving way?
Sure.
Right? Not like offending them or
Totally.
maybe like reading them off.
Yeah, knowing what to say, how to say it, definitely. That's good. What else goes through you guys' minds?
I tend to try to fix things, I think, and even like when it just comes to my friends, and so I think making sure to stop all of the running thoughts in my head before they finish talking.
Yeah.
So I can hear everything, and even if it's just like affirm what they're saying rather than putting a whole game plan out,
Yeah.
would be better.
Totally. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I want to springboard off of that and into this presentation. So, yeah, I appreciate you guys sharing. And obviously, there's a lot of experience in this room. And so I'm not coming at you like, hey, this is like the ABCs and this is how you should have been doing it all along. But I think especially, and as Lizzie pointed out, when we face challenges, I think there's a lot of times when it's hard exactly to know how to navigate those conversations, those barriers that we face. So this is really intended to give you a framework that becomes hopefully more instinctual as time goes on, so that you have something to fall back on about how to have a good conversation with anybody in any setting, with as many people as one in a one-on-one, as 8 in a cabin, as an entire audience, and anything in between. Okay. So the idea is to give you a framework that gives you sort of an easy pattern that you can follow. Some of you have heard this before because we used to do biblical counseling stuff here, the Love, No, Speak, Do model. But I really want to take it from a more, like I said before, rubber meets the road perspective. So it's going to be a lot more interactive, and I'm going to be asking you guys how you would apply each of those steps, Love, No, Speak, Do, into different situations. So if you're taking notes, you can go ahead and write this. This will be our outline for tonight. The way we approach conversations is first in our attitude, right, in the kind of position of our hearts, which is one of love, and then how we begin the engagement, right, how we begin the conversation, again, with anybody, non-Christian or Christian, is to know, to understand, to sympathize, to get where they're coming from, and to speak, right? How do we speak truth in love? How do we have those conversations in a biblical but also a right and kind way, as Rebecca was saying? And then finally, to make it practical, how do we help them change because of the conversation? Like, how do we both walk away from this interaction that we just had a little bit better because we had the conversation? So that's kind of the outline. Let's start with love. If you have your Bibles, we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians 13, 1 to 3. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 to 3, and then maybe Carlo, if you'd like to start. We're going to read a verse at a time, and we can just kind of stand up.
To speak in tongues, or of men, or of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or dependency.
Question?
If I have a gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing.
If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing.
Okay, observations from this. Huh? Did you say love? There we go. I think that's it. Excellent.
I think this one addresses the heart before you bring up any actions that we do.
Sure.
So it's kind of more the internal versus external beginning versus the other way around.
Sure.
I think according to this, love is our first priority. It talks about if I have a faith that moves mountains, if I
Right.
preach to people, all those things are important, but if you don't have love, you're nothing. So it gives us a priority list of loving others first, and then everything comes and follows.
Totally. Good. So I think you guys are hitting on kind of the big gist, right, which is that love's primary. I want to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of giftings, right, because that's what Paul is describing, prophetic powers, right, understanding mysteries and all knowledge. Even like martyrdom, right, if I deliver up my body to be burned, these big noble things. So maybe you don't think about those things, right? When you think about like your giftings or your big acts of faith, maybe it's not like, oh, I want to prophesy or I want to be a martyr. But what is it for you? What do you typically think of as the strengths or the deeds of a good cabinet leader? Like I should be this way. I need to work on this.
Humility.
Humility? Okay. Good. Humility. So character, right? Definitely character.
Learning how to listen, active listening, and empathy.
Yeah.
These are things we wish we had.
I mean, it could be anything. So I think the general question is like, what do you typically think of when you think of a gifted cabinet leader? So it's either stuff that you have, or wish you had, seen other people that they have, aspire to have for yourself.
I think it's someone that's very relational that you can easily talk to. They
Sure.
understand you.
Sure.
Being someone that they can trust, that they feel like they can trust to tell whatever they want.
I think like preparing your prayer for your captain.
Kind of going off of that, I think that really going to camp to serve and not to like get the recognition or like feel important, but really being there like how Jesus washed his disciples' feet, really being humble.
Yeah. That's good. If we're being honest with ourselves, what kinds of things are we tempted to like value in a cabinet leader? And maybe we shouldn't, right? Like for me, like, oh, I wish I could like dunk on all these kids. Then if I could dunk on them, right, then like, every kid would admire me and respect me and ask me for advice, and then I could really show them Jesus. So like, convert them by dunking on, like or being cool in general. Like high schoolers like talking to. Yeah. So, is there anything that you guys, you know what I'm getting at, right? Like something that maybe we shouldn't attribute to a good cabinet leader, but that's what we sometimes do.
Like knowing all the answers. Like it's good to know your
Sure.
Bible, obviously, but don't make knowing all the answers your top priority.
Sure. Yeah.
I've kind of thought before, like, how many times have I gotten my kids to cry?
Yeah, being emotionally manipulative.
That's pretty good. Like,
Tally another one. Another one this week.
Yeah.
That was a good one-on-one right there.
Ooh, last night,
Got
That's
five
right.
last night.
we ran out of Kleenex.
Alright, send the next guy.
Send the next
I don't think that.
Yeah. No, that's real. That's real. Yeah. Anything else?
Charisma?
Sure. Yeah, that's a huge one. Yeah.
I feel like this is more applicable to like girls, but like cabin leaders that are more artistic than others or more creative than others. I think for me it's especially difficult because my sister is like a conferee right now. She's gonna be a senior, and so I've heard her like grow up talk about like, oh my gosh, like my cabin leader this year made us these signs and they were so beautiful, and she like talks so highly about these like gifts that she got. So it's hard for me to like not compare
Right.
like, you know,
Right.
to that because I know that she likes it.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I think this is a really good list, and some of them I think are good things that we need to pursue, like really good, humility, as Matt said, character things, being someone who can be approached, who people can trust. But then obviously there's also like other stuff that comes into play that we know shouldn't be there, but if we're being honest with ourselves, we feel like we need, right? Being charismatic, knowing our whole Bible, or whatever. The thesis, I think, of this passage that we just read is that obviously more important than like being charismatic, but even still more important than even the good things that we mentioned, is that we love. Like the primary determinant of your success at camp is going to be how much you love your kids. And I don't mean success in terms of if they cry, or if they get converted, or how much more they love Jesus. They might come out of your cabin not loving Jesus at all, like any more than they did prior. The word that's preached by Kim and Dave might just hit like stone cold hearts. But the thesis, I think, is that we evaluate everything first and foremost by if we love, So the next slide. Kind of 3 subpoints here. So if you're taking notes, you can write these down. First, love tells us that we're not the point. That you're not the point. Like there's always this temptation, right, to especially if you're a first-time cabin leader, but even if you're like a vet, right, there's this temptation to kind of establish yourself. If you're new, like, oh, I belong here, right, there's like imposter syndrome, or you want to belong. And if you're a vet, like, no, I need to have, my things together. I need to have my cabin time together. I need to have all this stuff together because I'm a vet, right? So I'm supposed to be someone who can be looked up to. But that's about you. That's about you. And love says, like, it doesn't matter, like, how the rest of this staff looks at me. It doesn't matter how my conferees look at me. If I'm just loving them, then regardless of the response, I can rest. So I would really encourage you to think about how can you think about yourself less and think about other people more, right? And you've probably heard this before, the idea that humility isn't thinking like less of yourself, right? Like artificially kind of downplaying, like, oh, I'm not that like artistic, I'm not that, knowledgeable of the Bible. If you are, you are, right? If you're outgoing, you're outgoing. If you're fun to be around, you're fun to be around. So it's not so much about thinking about yourself in a lesser way. It's just thinking about yourself less often. And I think if you read Philippians 2, and I wish we had time to get there, but I think if you read Philippians 2, that's really the thesis of how Jesus lived, that he put other people first, that he counted them as more significant. So you're not the point. Second, some people are not fun to love. You're going to have conferees, and some of you already have had. And even if it's not conferee, like forget Mount Hermon for a moment. There are just some people who are hard to love, period. Like you can probably think of somebody right now. And when you think about that person, right, think about your response. Think about your response. Right? Like a good way to love the kids at Mount Hermon that you're going to have in your cabin well is to start loving the people in your life right now who are hard to love better. Right? Like we're all gearing up, like I'm going to pray for these kids. I'm going to make sure that I take care of them. Are you praying for and taking care of the people who are around you right now? Right? If we, I mean, the Bible teaches us, right, that like even the world loves people who love them back, but Christ loves people who rebelled against him, and that's us, and complements us, and I think the thrust of the gospel is going to tell us that we got to love hard people, right? So I think if there's nothing else that you take away from this slide, like think about the person who's hard to love in your life right now, because I'm sure there's somebody, and think about how you can love them better, right? And maybe you just have to start with asking God for help to do that. Finally, it's easy to label. What I mean by this is, you know how like the first night, right, or the first impression you get of anybody, right? Forget Mount Hermon again. You kind of like associate them with something, right? This is the jock. Oh, this kid's gonna be a problem. Or this person talks a lot. You know, like you just kind of like slap a label on them. Or even in your own circles, right? Oh, this friend of mine, this friend is the needy friend, or this friend is the friend who's always got drama, or this friend is the, right? So we slap these labels onto people. But love tells us that the person is a person and is not described by these really prominent deficiencies or these really glaring sins that they deal with, right? Or even their strengths, right? Like, because it could go the other way. Oh, this guy is the really nice guy, you know? Because when you start labeling people, right, then you blind yourself to everything else about them. Because this person isn't just nice, right? There are other things about them, some things that could be really serious, right? Sin that's in their life that you also need to confront. This person might be really dramatic, but they might have something really good to offer. They might be really thoughtful in this way. And if you just label, then you don't give yourself a chance to get to know the whole person. So love says know the whole person, and not just a particular problem or project, but the whole person. Okay. So you're not the point. Some people are not fun to love, and it's easy to label. Next slide. I think the next ones will be faster. Okay. Love, know, speak to. So let's go to Proverbs chapter 18. We're snaking around, right? So, Joe, when you get there, can you read Proverbs 18:13 for us?
18:13?
Yeah.
Okay. If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame.
Okay. Did everyone get that?
One more time.
Yeah.
If one gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame.
Okay. So again, like the Proverbs were written as part of this genre, like wisdom genre, right? As wisdom literature. So they're really applicable for anybody. So this again is applicable in non-Christian conversations just like it is in Christian conversations. Basically, what is it saying? Yeah. Listen before you talk. Right? Listen, like ask questions, figure out what you're dealing with before you start talking. Auntie Karen talked about this in the first timers meeting, and I thought it was really good. I want to re-emphasize it. Like most of cabin time should not be you talking. Most of cabin time should not be you talking. If you're doing most of the talking, then there's a problem. You got to know. You got to know. And let me give you some practical tips about how to do that. Okay? Can you guys see this? It's a little small, maybe in the back. I'll read it out loud. Okay. See what I did here? Doesn't that mean you should ask more questions and talk less? That's a question. So the answer is yes, right? So I wanted to give you guys two categories to think about when it comes to what kinds of questions do I ask. And there are the objective and the subjective questions. Objective and subjective. So objective is like what's happening in reality. Subjective is how do you feel about it. Okay? So objective situational questions, what's going on, what's happening, right? What do you do for fun? What are you involved in at school? You know, how were finals? Those are objective questions because they describe what's going on. Okay. You should always start with objective questions. Okay, when you're getting to know a person, right? And we do this normally, like what do you do for a living, right? Or what do you go up to this summer or whatever, right? That's just data that you know. This second question here, can you guys see it? Have any of you guys gone through that before? So that I threw in there because I want you guys to think about how can you involve other people in a conversation when just one person is sharing, right? So if I'm having a cabin time, right, and somebody's like, man, I failed the test, right? And I'm talking about how hard that is. Then I'm going to ask other people, like, have any of you failed a test before? Or if you haven't, can you sympathize with them, right? Like getting them involved in the conversation that I'm just having with this one person. Okay? So you want to think about what objective reality is the person in front of me, and then even the people around us who are listening in on this conversation, what objective reality exists in their life. And then there's the subjective, the interpretive questions. How do you feel? Right? How do you feel? How does that make you feel? What kinds of emotions are you feeling? Right? So we kind of started this session with it, right? How many of you guys have led small group before or been part of a small group? That's the objective. That's just historical, right? And then how did you feel when you ran into those barriers? Okay? So I'm trying to illustrate, like you go from the objective to the subjective. Okay? And then if someone talks about like, oh, I failed this test and it felt really awful, right? Have you ever failed something? How did you guys feel? Can you relate to Brian who's sharing about this thing that he failed? Does it make sense? So objective and subjective. Listen for the good, hard, bad. I wish I could spend more time on this, but like, so you might have heard this before, that in everything that someone says, you're going to hear three things. There's the good, there's the hard, and there's the bad. So there's the good stuff, right? I studied really hard for this test. Okay, that's good. I'm really glad that you studied really hard for this test, right? Then there's the hard. I failed. I feel miserable, right? Like now my parents are angry at me, right? Or I'm gonna have to retake this class, right? That's difficult. And then the bad. Now I'm anxious, or now I'm angry at God, or now I don't trust that God has my future in His hands, or whatever, right? So really listen for those three kinds of things. Okay, go ahead. We're going to skip the case studies. Okay. Love, know, speak, and do. Let's turn to Ephesians 4 together. Ephesians 4. Ephesians 4, 11 to 16. Where do we stop, Joe? So Leslie? Can you start in Ephesians 4, verse 11, and then go this one?
And he gave the apostles, the prophets, and the evangelists, the shepherds, and the teachers,
to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ.
Until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge and of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ.
Nick.
We no longer children, tossed to and fro, and carried about every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and craftiness, after the wiles of error.
We'll just get this one.
Okay. Okay. Rather speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in Him.
Okay. I want you to notice something. So keep your eyes on the passage. Okay. Go to verse 12. Who does the work of ministry? The saints, right? And when Paul uses the word saints, you might have heard this before too. When Paul uses the word saints, who's he talking about?
Believers.
Right, all believers, us. Every Christian is a saint. And that was Paul's vernacular. So he's really saying that what? All Christians participate in the work of ministry, participate in building up the body of Christ. Do you see that? Okay, so that's in verse 12. And then he says, if you look at verse 14, the goal is to avoid what? Being deceived, right? Carried around by every wind of doctrine, so bad theology, right? Human cunning, craftiness, kind of the lies of the world. You don't want to be deceived. But then listen to this, okay? Verse 15, and this is going to illustrate how do we do ministry as Christians. He says, rather, or in contrast to letting people be deceived, what should we do? Speaking the truth in love. Exactly. Right? With the goal being that we grow as a body. and Rebecca referred to this earlier, speaking the truth in love. And I want you to see the logic. Every Christian has this call, that this is our ministry. And we want to avoid, right, negative consequences, bad theology, heresy, people being tricked, deceived by the lies of the world. And how do we do it? What's the means by which we accomplish that? It's speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love. Okay, so next slide. Here are some practical tips for your conversations. Okay, number one, and this might be a little counterintuitive, but I want you to pay attention here. Use questions to speak. Use questions to speak. Right. So like when we're just going through Ephesians 4, right? I could have just been like, okay, here's what I see in this passage. Here's what I see. Look at this verse. This is what Paul's talking about. But it helps even in a small way to ask you guys what you think, to see if you're coming to the same conclusions as I am, right? Because if you're not, I want to know that. And if I just talk at you, I'm never going to know that you don't think the way I do. Okay. So using questions to help people arrive at the truth for themselves is something I would really encourage you guys to do. Because we have questions for getting to know people, right? The objective reality of what's going on, and then subjectively how they feel about it. But a lot of times at that point we then pivot to what? To giving them a sermon, right? To like talking at them for the next 20 minutes. And I would encourage you to use questions all the way through. And here are some questions that I would suggest to you. First, what are you saying about God? Especially if they're churched, right, Nick? So if you have like churched kids, they know what's in their heads, like they know what's true, right? But if they're sharing, I'm really anxious because I failed this test. Now I don't think I'm going to get into a good college, and I'm unhappy. All right, what are you saying about God? What are you saying about God? I'd love to know if you can come to your own conclusions about what the implications are of that. Does that make sense? Another question that you should have in your back pocket. What do you think the Bible has to say about that? What do you think the Bible has to say about that? Okay. Especially if they're churched, again. Another one, what truths do you need to believe? What truths do you need to believe? Right? And a lot of these are kind of like rephrasing this similar idea. You're trying to get them to preach to themselves. And then remember how we talked about getting other people involved? Right? So that's why this fourth question is here. How would you guys encourage him or her? All right, Brian's going through this thing right now. Well, I'd love to know, how would you guys talk to Brian? I know what I want to say to Brian as the cabin leader, but I want to know what you guys would say to your brother, your sister who's in pain right now. Okay? And then, what do we speak? Two things. First, reference the sermons. Okay, as much as possible, don't make cabin time session number 2. Please don't make, like, as much as possible say, well, actually, Kim talked about this on Tuesday, right? Or David just said this in point number 2, which means that you got to be paying attention, right? So you got to reference the sermons that they just heard, and then, if necessary, reference other parts of Scripture, right? But your job should be easy. Your job should be easy because Kim's and David's jobs are the hard jobs. They're the ones who have to do all the heavy lifting and the studying and the prepping and the teaching, right? And you're kind of riding their coattails a little bit. And you can always say, I don't know. You can always, and should a lot of times, say, I think I have an answer, but I'd love to think about it a little bit more, right? Okay, finally. Okay, last passage, Matthew 7. Matthew 7. Where do we stop? Rebecca, so Cameron is next. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27.
Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock.
And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand.
The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash.
Great. Thank you. How many of you have heard this parable before that Jesus uses? Okay, great. I want you to notice something. We always talk about the difference, right? What's the similarity between these two guys in this parable? They both have something in common. If you look at verse 24 and verse 26, they actually have something in common. They both heard the words. Exactly. Thank you, Derek. So they both heard the words. And everybody who goes to Mount Hermon, by definition, is going to hear the word, right? What's the difference? What's the difference? Huh? Yeah. Is the word going to take root? Is it going to change what they do? Is it going to change what they do? Exactly. Right? So you're going to help them do. You know they heard. What are they going to do? And that's a key differentiator. And so never, ever, ever stop at, did you guys get that? Do you understand what Kim was preaching? Do you understand what Dave was preaching? Can you speak it back to me? Oh, that was so good. That was so like articulate. That was beautiful. Like, I'm gonna write that down because I wanna say it that way too. All right, everyone, good night. No. What's gonna change? What's gonna change? I know you get it, right? What's gonna change? So next slide. Okay, again, use questions to do, guys. As much as we can, use questions to go from A through Z, right? So, what do you think you should do? Okay. All right. So what's your situation? Okay, that's your situation. How do you feel about it? Okay, in how you feel, what are you saying about God? What are you saying about God? Is there a lie? What do you need to believe? What's true? Okay, now that you recognize what's true, how's that going to change what you do? Right? Do you think that you should live a little bit differently after camp is over? You understand that, right? And be specific, right? I would really encourage you to write this down if you're taking notes. Be specific. High schoolers, bless you, and just like anybody else, but especially high schoolers, like who have ADD, right? Like you need to be specific with them, right? How and when and where. So, oh, great, you're going to read the Bible just like everybody else. Okay, well, when are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? What are you going to read? Where are you going to read? Right? Be specific with them. Don't let them give you the like, yeah, I'll pray more, because you'll get a lot of that. Right? I'll love my friends more. Name a friend. Right? Where do you see them? What are you going to do? Okay. And then remember, get other people involved, right? So how can we help? We're your cabin, right? We're your cabin. I'm your cabin leader. These people are your friends. How can we help you? How can we help you? So do you want us to text you next Saturday night? Make sure you're going to sleep on time and are going to wake up on Sunday morning. Is that going to help you? Right? How can we get involved and give you a hand? And then this is really key, and I want to end here. How will your church help? How will your church help? We're going to talk about this a lot at the next training meeting. Mount Hermon exists for the church, and we've been hammering that from day one. Mount Hermon exists to make the church stronger. Okay? So don't let them stop their thinking at Saturday when they take the buses home. Right? Make them think about, when I go home, how am I going to be practicing all of this stuff? And how can I get the people at my church to help me out? So maybe you're not the one to text them on Saturday night. Maybe it's their buddy from youth group who should be texting them on Saturday night, making sure they go to sleep on time, making sure they go to church in the morning. Does that make sense? So I really wanted to emphasize that. Okay, we've got 10 minutes. This is the same prayer slide that we used last time. Why don't we split up into, we're working on the gender grade